The history of the British Mark series of tanks. In December 1950, the final prototype was ready for the first trials, which took place in April 1916. It was named officially His Majesty's Landship Centipede, but was also known as Mother or Big Willie, as a joke directed towards German Kaiser and the Crown Prince, both named Wilhelm. The trials led up to an impressive reconstruction of a no-man's land with trenches, craters, and barbed wire, and impressed all officers except the Secretary of War, Lord Kitchener. Despite this, an order was secured for 150 in 2 batches, with one being issued on the 12th of February 1960 and the other on April 23rd. The Mark I was elaborated to encompass all lessons learned from the Little Willie trials in 1915. No turret armament mounted in spanions, bolted hull made of boiler panels, newly redesigned tracks inherited from Little Willie, and a large, easily recognizable rhomboid hull, with the tracks surrounding the hull, making up the entire length of the machine. This shape could not be underestimated. While Great Britain learned the difficult trade of crossing heavily cratered, muddy terrain with the previous Lincoln machine, a radical solution was adopted which provided adequate to the task, but too radical at the same time, and would emerge in post-war years. Indeed, a running track of this size allowed the gap to the largest known trenches of the time negotiate craters, while the front 3 recesses allowed the vehicle to climb almost any obstacle. But in addition to being heavy, these full running tracks caused safety problems for the crew members, who could get caught in and dragged under the tank. It also limited the ability to store anything on top, save for a narrow position on the center hull. Visibility was predictable, and a lot of space was lost by cramming all of the return rollers, a nightmare for engineers, as well as a maintenance crew. Propulsion relied on a 6-cylinder petrol engine at the rear of the hull, due to the transmission system tunnel, which ran through the tank. More importantly, because at that stage the engine was relatively untested and finicky enough to force engineers to need to be able to get their hands on the engine just in case. In addition, the engine had to push quite hard to carry the 28 tons of steel, with its just 105 horsepower, with a crushingly low 3.7 horsepower per tonnage. Not surprisingly, the burden was made greater by the incredibly sticky nature of the mud, which was shown by recent studies to just stick to metal, which meant it had a tremendous force and was required to extract whatever was plunged in it. At least in the case of the tracks, the flat shape and serial arrangement made it more likely to surf on the surface, although taking a large amount of mud in the process. Being clogged in sinkholes was just the level of effort which the valiant little Daimler was not ready to undertake. Breakdowns were commonplace and ruined this early stage of the assault, largely diminishing the number of tanks that had just had the luck to make their way into the no man's land and reach their destination. Also, the engine not being separated from the fighting compartment proved ruinous for the crew, which fell ill quite quickly, but that feature remained unchanged until 1918. The General Staff didn't see this sickness as a limitation either, given the relatively short distance which had to be crossed between opposing trenches. A mobility aspect which was incorporated into the design concerned the removable spanions, allowing the tank to be narrower, thus providing easier transport by rail. The crew was comprised of 8 men, 2 of which were drivers, one for the gearbox and the other for the brakes, and 2 were controlling the gears of each track. This system was needed in perfect coordination, which was difficult due to the noise inside the protective leather helmets they used. The other 4 were gunners, serving the 6-pounders and the machine guns, depending on the armament. 50% of the Mark series were armed with 2 guns in the spanions and 3 machine guns, 2 in the spanions and 1 axle in the hull, named males, and the other half were named females, armed with 5 machine guns. These were either Vickers models or the 8mm Hotchkiss air-cooled equivalent. The tanks were quite big, weighing 28 tons with 8 meters long hull and an overall length nearly 10 meters, with the additional tail wheel, another feature kept from the Little Willie. It was designed to help cross very large trenches, but later proved impractical and was dropped. Production. No less than 150 Mark I's were built at William Foster & Company. The first order of 100 was increased to 150 in April 1916, acting as a pre-series for further mass productions. The Foster deliveries concerned 37 males, while the Metropolitan Carriage wagon delivered 113 tanks, including 38 males and 75 females. Later on, 2 rails were mounted over the hull to handle a wooden beam used for unditching. The first were ready in a hurry, deployed in August, just in time for the Somme offensive. From the end of 1917 until 1918, some of the surviving ones were converted as single tanks with a large antenna at the base of the driver's cab, participating in the Battle of Cambrai. Others were converted as supply tanks. Succession to the Mark II and III. As the Mark I showed many limitations, for the next batch of 50 tanks, 25 females and 25 males, were built at Foster & Co. for training purposes only. There were some claims about their unhardened steel plates, but all data seems to show that the Mark IIs were regular Mark I's with a few modifications for training purposes. Some 20 were sent to France for advanced training, and those that remained at the Wool Training Ground in Dorset. However, in 1917 there weren't enough tanks operational for the offensives planned in April 1917 near Arras, and 20 surviving Mark I's and all the Mark IIs remaining in Britain were put into action, despite some protests, suffering high casualties mainly due to the new armor-piercing bullets that the Germans employed. The Mark IIIs were training tanks as well, though great improvements were still planned for the Mark IV, and were all fitted with Lewis machine guns in smaller, lighter spanions. Otherwise, few changes were visible at the beginning. At this batch of 50 vehicles was designed to incorporate all the Mark IV improvements. Deliveries were slow, and none left Great Britain. Mark I specifications. Dimensions. Length was 26 feet, or 7.92 meters. Width was 8 feet, 4 inches, and height was 8 feet. Total weight was 27.5 for the female, and 28.4 tons for the male. Crew 8. Propulsion. A British Foster Daimler Knight sleeve valve water-cooled straight 6 13-liter petrol engine that could produce 105 horsepower at 1,000 RPMs. Its road speed topped out at 3.7 miles per hour or 5.95 kilometers per hour. Its range was 28 miles or 45 kilometers. Its trench crossing ability was 11 feet 6 inches or 3.5 meters. Total production was 150 units. The Mark II tank was superficially identical to the Mark I. The Army had already declared that the Mark I was still insufficiently developed for use. Therefore, orders for the Mark II were placed in July 1917. It was to be a simple, limited upgrade, but since the development of better models would have taken some time, the Mark II was retained as a stopgap and for training units only. There was, and still is, a controversy about whether their construction used mild, unhardened steel or not, due to their planned use since the beginning as training tanks. Some doubt was cast on this claim in early 1917. Debates still rage, despite the fact that 20 males were sent to France to beef up depleted units and fight, and it is dubious that these have been reconstructed in the meantime, either at home or in France with regular hardened steel. The Mark IIs were delivered from December 1916 to July 1917 by Foster & Co. 25 males and 25 females in all. The males still had the long barrel Navy gun and all shared the heavy barbette model. The females had 4 2 per side Vickers water-cooled .303 caliber or 7.62 millimeter machine guns. The Mark IIs were essentially similar to the Mark I's, with one of the few actual differences being slightly narrower central section, meant to allow the use of wider tracks. However, this never came to be. 5 Mark IIs were still used in experiments with proving power plants and transmissions. An open competition proved that the opportunity for many firms to improve the design. Comparative demonstrations were held in March 1917 on a realistic testing ground, but only 3 Mark IIs were completed. Together with the mother refitted a Daimler petrol-electric system. Wilson's gear system replaced the secondary gear and proved to clearly be superior. As a result, it became standard in later designs. The Mark II in action. 20 were shipped to France and 25 remained at the training ground at Wool, Dorset in Britain. The remaining 5 mils were kept for testing vehicles. Since the Mark IV had not arrived by early 1917, it was decided to ship the 25 training vessels remaining in Great Britain to France. They joined 20 other Mark IIs and 15 Mark Is at the Battle of Arras in April 1917. Their armor proved vulnerable to the armor-piercing machine gun ammunition used by the Germans. The female Mark IIs also had a fatal flaw for its crew. The hatch in the back of the spanions, which was used to access and escape the vehicle, was quite small, and when the petrol tanks located at the front caught on fire, not all the crew made it. There was also an additional hatch above the driver's compartment and another one in the back, which were not large nor easier to access. Surviving Mark IIs were used as supply tanks until the end of the war. As of today, the sole surviving Mark II on record is female, numbered F-53, famously named the Flying Scotsman, displayed in a static model at Bovington Tank Museum, showing battle damage sustained at the Battle of Arras in April 1917. Another one was reconstructed from surviving parts, from number 799, which can be seen at Beaucourt, Artros, France. The Mark II specifications are identical to the Mark I, with the exception being the total production of units was 50. The development of the Mark III. Like the Mark II, the Mark III was essentially a stopgap tank used for training, waiting for the arrival of the upgraded Mark IV, the true successor to the Mark I. There are no extensive records on how much they were modified compared to the Mark I or II, and few photos survive to bring other clues to the table, if any at all. Essentially, the Mark III was identical to the Mark I and II, with the same supposed use of soft armor, but hard evidence for this is plainly missing. Females used lighter Lewis machine guns in smaller and lighter spanions, which are the only way to clearly distinguish the type. This batch of 50 vehicles was designed to incorporate all the Mark IV improvements when ready, so as to train new recruits for the Mark IV and V series. However, the developments of these features took some time, and the Mark IIIs were apparently delivered as is. None ever left Great Britain. The Mark IV. The Mark IV was a greatly improved version of the first British tank, the Mark I. It was better protected and the fuel tank was relocated. It was numerically the most important tank of the First World War, with 1,220 built, 420 were male, 595 were female, and 205 tenders. First blood for the Mark IV came on June 7, 1917, with the attack of Messiaen Ridge. The terrain was very rugged, heavily cratered, but cold and dry, which allowed some 60-plus tanks some success, although lagging behind the infantry. Later, during the Third Battle of Ypres, most of the Mark IVs literally sank in the mud. The power-to-weight ratio was such that in a heavily cratered terrain and swampy ground, the Mark IVs frequently bogged down and overheated, and overused engines usually broke down in the process of bailing out. Most fell prey to German artillery or were captured afterwards. Their contribution was insignificant. However, in November 1917, at Cambriel, a large construction of Mark IVs, 460, proved decisive despite a complicated and well-defensed trench system. During the German spring offensive, British officers discovered in surprise some German assault troops were accompanied by captured Mark Is and IVs. These Boyata Panzer sightings rose so often that the encounters with the German-built A-7Vs were rare in comparison. This led to the War Office to order the modification of the armaments of some Mark Vs into hermaphrodites fitted on one side with a female spanion and the other side a male spanion. to give these tanks a way to deal with the enemy armor should they come across it. However, the first tank-to-tank duel involved one of these German A7Vs during the Second Battle of Villers-Brontex in April 1918. Two British Mark IV females and one male spotted and engaged the A7V. But after several hit and misses, the two females, useless, retired. After many shots and 2 hits, both tanks retired in a draw. When the Mark V, better protected with a better engine and greater speed, came into service, the production of the Mark IVs was phased out, and at last converted as supply tanks. No Mark IVs seem to have been witness to the Whites in Russia. However, a few Budopanzers Mark IVs took part in the revolutionary events in 1919 on the Army's side. 7 Mark IVs have survived. Mark IV specifications. Its length was 26 feet 5 inches or 8.05 meters. Its width with spanions was 13 feet 6 inches. Height was 8 feet 2 inches. Total weight for the female was 27 tons and the male 28 tons. The crew was 8. Propulsion was the British Foster Daimler 6-cylinder inline sleeve valve petrol engine at 105 horsepower at 1000 RPMs. Road speed 3.5 miles or 5.63 kilometers. It had a range of 15 miles or 24.14 kilometers. Trench crossing ability was 10 feet due to the tadpole being removed. Total production 1,220 units. The Mark V was the last and largest British tank produced during the war. Born as a very advanced project, it ended up being an enhanced Mark IV. Together with its diversities, the Mark V, around 1,070, were completed by March 1919. The Mark V kept all external features of the Mark IV, including the hull, rollers, and track, in order not to disturb production. However, a new, more powerful drivetrain and transmission were ready at the beginning of 1917, and tests ordered by William Stern were conducted on modified Mark IVs. These systems included a petrol-electric schemes, hydraulic systems, a multiple clutch system, only a single driver was needed. A new, more powerful 19-liter 6-cylinder inline Ricardio engine at 150 bhp was chosen, giving a power-weight ratio of 5.2 bhp per ton, with 450-liter fuel capacity, or 93 gallons, or enough for approximately 10 hours on rugged terrain. The hull was fitted with a second rear cabin with an observation slits and hinged sides, allowing the fitting for an unditching wooden beam. The rear part of the hull also received an additional machine gun mount. Production of the Mark V started at the Metropolitan Carriage and Wagon Factory in the fall of 1917. The first batch arrived in France in May 1918, and total production was 400, of which 200 were male and 200 were female. The last were delivered by mid-1919. Only available in small quantities by mid-1918, the impact of the Mark V was not significant, but 3 months later they were numerous enough to make a difference. The first major engagement was the Battle of Hamel on July 7, 1918, when 60 tanks led the victorious offensive of the Australian troops against the German lines. Later, in August, 288 Mark Vs were involved, together with a numerous Mark A Whippet in the Battle of the Amiens, a complete success. The Mark V took part in 8 major offensives until the armistice. At the same time, Canadian and U.S. Army troops trained on Mark Vs. The 301st American Heavy Tank Battalion was entirely equipped with these, and were thrown into action from September to November in 1918 against the Hindenburg Line with heavy losses. 18 of the 21 were lost or disabled. After the armistice, 70 Mark Vs were given by the British government to the White Russian faction fighting against the Bolsheviks. But as the situation worsened, a growing number of captured Mark V's took action under the red flag. There is no record of duels between red and white Mark V's, but they ended as a substantial part of the Red Army and were thoroughly studied. They took part in several actions in 1921, including the Battle of Tbilisi. Lithuanian and Levatin Mark V's were still active in 1939. The Mark V specifications. The length was 26 feet 5 inches or 8.05 meters. Width without spanions, 8 feet 4 inches. Height, 8 feet 8 inches. The female weighed 28.5 tons and the male weighed 29 tons. Crew was 8. Road speed 4.6 miles per hour or 7.4 kilometers per hour. Its range was 25 miles or 40.24 kilometers. Hey, thank you for watching the history of the Mark tank. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you can. If you already did, thank you. And special thanks to the Tank Encyclopedia Online. And have a nice day. Bye.